14 days ago, Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, and the world, I think we'd all agree, has dramatically changed. There's a great deal of fear and uncertainty right now in the world. What I've done is had a look back at some talks that I've given in recent years, and I found one back in 2016 that I gave in the April. And this particular talk is all about Vladimir Putin and where Putin is mentioned specifically in the Bible. I believe Vladimir Putin is described in detail in two passages in the Bible specifically. One is in Daniel chapter 8, and the other passage is in Daniel chapter 11. And I would urge you to have a look at this talk and compare what I'm saying in these two chapters and the verses to Vladimir Putin himself. That's what this talk does. And if we're right that Vladimir Putin is the person spoken about in these two chapters, then clearly we're on the brink of incredible events, because the atrocities that we're seeing right now happen in Ukraine are as nothing compared to what's going to come in Ukraine and what's going to come after that at some point, which is Russia coming down to invade Israel itself. And that is what we all know as Armageddon. And all of these things herald the return of Jesus back to the earth. So I hope you sort of enjoy this video in inverted commas, but hopefully it sheds a lot of light on who this man is and why God is against him. Right, well, here we are again. This is a prophecy update, but I've got to admit that I've changed what we were going to do this evening. It's still a prophecy update, but there's been some really remarkable things that have been uncovered and disclosed in the last week and in the last sort of 4 or 5 weeks that have been on two panorama programs. I'm sure you might have perhaps seen them. And I thought, because of the revelations that have been made, and because of the significance of the revelations that have been made, for this prophecy update, we're going to look at those discoveries that have recently, well, they're still in the press as we speak today. So I hope you don't feel shortchanged by what we're going to look at, but it is a prophecy update. So there we are. And things are moving so quickly, aren't they? We've got to try and keep up to speed with the things that are happening. So the title of this talk, as you can see on the screen, is Epiphanies, Putin and the People of God. For the full title, of course, would be Antiochus Epiphanies, Vladimir Putin and the People of God. And we're going to have a look at some absolutely astounding prophecies in the Bible that only in recent weeks can we see crystal clear the significance of verses that were written 2.5 millennia ago. So what we're going to be doing is having a think about two particular prophecies, or visions I should really say, that Daniel had. Now, Daniel actually had 4 visions. He had 4 visions. The first vision that he had was in Daniel chapter 7. And that vision was about the 4 beasts and about a little horn. And we're not looking at that at all tonight. The second vision that he had, we are going to look at tonight, because that is in Daniel chapter 8. And in Daniel chapter 8, Daniel had a vision about 2 beasts, a ram and a goat. We're going to look at that. And so that was his second vision. The third vision that Daniel had, which we're not going to look at tonight, is in Daniel chapter 9, and that we know is called the 70-week prophecy. We're not looking at that tonight. But we are going to look at Daniel chapter 11 especially, because Daniel chapter 11 is the 4th vision that Daniel actually was given. And so we're going to look at Daniel 8 and Daniel 11. Daniel 8 and Daniel 11 are inextricably linked together. Daniel 7 and Daniel 9 are inextricably linked together. But as I say, tonight is Daniel 8 and Daniel 11. So what I'm going to do is play you what I've put together in terms of what Daniel saw. Now, this is using simple graphics and a bit of audio playing in the background, so this isn't sort of high-tech vision. Okay, Daniel's vision would have looked a lot better than what I'm going to show you, but this is as good as I could make it look in PowerPoint. So let's have a look at what Daniel saw in Daniel chapter 8.
Chapter 8. In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision after the one that had already appeared to me. In my vision I saw myself in the citadel of Susa in the province of Elam. In the vision I was beside the Ulai Canal. I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns, standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as he charged toward the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against him, and none could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between his eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. He came toward the 2-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal, and charged at him in great rage. I saw him attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering his 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against him. The goat knocked him to the ground and trampled on him, and none could rescue the ram from his power. The goat became very great, but at the height of his power, his large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came another horn, which started small but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the prince of the host. It took away the daily sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was brought low. Because of rebellion, the host of the saints and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. Then I heard a Holy One speaking, and another Holy One said to him, "How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled, the vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, and the surrender of the sanctuary and of the host that will be trampled underfoot?" He said to me, "It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated."
It's a strange sort of vision, isn't it? I mean, you can imagine Daniel, having seen that, wondering what on earth it was actually all about. Who could interpret it? Well, of course, the Lord God interpreted it. And fortunately for us, it's all interpreted in this very same chapter. So we don't have to guess at all at any of this vision. You know, I'm not having to stand here and try and make anything up, because here we are. So in Daniel chapter 8, in verse 20, an angel comes and explains to Daniel exactly what it all means. So here we are, look in verse 20, and this is in a slightly modern version, but even in the authorized version it says exactly the same. The 2-horned ram represents the kings of Media and Persia, so there's the Medes and the Persians. The shaggy male goat represents the king of Greece, and the large horn between his eyes represents the first king of the Greek Empire. The 4 prominent horns that replace the 1 large horn show that the Greek Empire will break into 4 kingdoms, but none as great as the first. So there we are. I mean, it's black and white, isn't it? Well, it's not black and white there, it's multicoloured, but it is black and white. So that ram that started off over there in the east was the Persian Empire, and the goat that came in that trampled all over it was the Greek Empire. So what we can now do is say, well, okay, the Bible has told us what all of this means. So that ram is the Persian Empire. The goat that came along was the Greek Empire. And any encyclopedia tells you that the Greek Empire followed straight on after the Persian Empire. The interesting thing, and we're not told the name of this particular person, but of course there's this large horn that this goat actually had. And at some point, the horn was broken off. Well, we know that the large horn represented or represents Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great was the ruler who, in effect, overcame the Persian Empire. As it says here, this is just taken from an encyclopedia. Alexander the Great came on the throne of Greece in October 336 BC. At the age of 20, he would soon destroy the Persian Empire and cover all the territories of the ancient world as far as India. So that large horn is Alexander the Great. Now, for a horn to be broken off, something dramatic happens to Alexander the Great, and of course something did happen because he died extremely suddenly at the age of 33. In verse 22 of Daniel chapter 8, it tells us what happens once the horn has been broken off. It says that the four horns that replace the one that was broken off represent four kingdoms that will emerge from his nation but will not have the same power. So I go to an encyclopedia. This one is Grolier Encyclopedia. And we read this in the encyclopedia. Alexander, talking about Alexander the Great, on June the 13th, 323 BC, died in his 33rd year. No heir had been appointed to the throne. His empire, the largest the world had known, was divided among his four generals. So an encyclopedia tells us exactly what Daniel 8 says, which is, when the horn's broken off, four new kingdoms will come from that. The four kingdoms that sprang out of the empire that was controlled by Alexander the Great were these. There was Cassander, which is modern-day Macedonia, Lysimachus, which is Asia Minor, and then you've got Ptolemy, that was down here in Egypt, and Seleucus, which was covering this area of round here in yellow, which is predominantly the area of Syria, which is where the Seleucid Empire was based. Even though their territory was much greater, their headquarters was in Syria. So, fine, the Bible lines up exactly with what history tells us, and bearing in mind, of course, that Daniel was receiving this vision hundreds and hundreds of years before Alexander the Great even existed. And many people have said the Bible is so accurate here, it must have been written after the event. Well, of course, it wasn't written after the event. It was written before the event, and we understand that to be true. But then what we find is that out of these four kingdoms, so the Empire of Greece broke into four different kingdoms, if you like, the four that we've just gone through. But then it says in verse 9 something interesting, because it says, out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great, toward the south, and toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. And it waxed great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground, and stamped on them. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him was the daily sacrifice taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. So what we're looking for is, out of these four horns that sprang up, we know that there's the Seleucids and the Ptolemies and so on. Out of one of those came another ruler that started off small but grew. So I'm going to suggest to you that actually it was the Seleucid Empire that became extremely powerful out of those four generals. So the kingdom split into four, and the Seleucid Empire became extremely powerful, based here in Syria, but it grew in a pretty dramatic way. The Ptolemaic Empire was down here in Egypt. And effectively, there is one person that came out of that fourth kingdom, the Seleucid kingdom, that really does fit the bill when you look at Daniel 8 and what it said that that little horn was going to do. So let's just have a little look at this particular man, because I think this is the little horn man that comes out of the Seleucid Empire, and his name's Antiochus Epiphanes. And this chap was ruling the Seleucid Empire from around about 175 BC. So why do I think that Antiochus Epiphanes is the little horn of Daniel chapter 8? Well, first of all, it isn't only me that's saying that. If you look in Wikipedia, if you look in pretty much any online Bible commentary, they'll say it's Antiochus Epiphanes, and I totally agree with them, it is. Here's Bible History Online. This is what it says about Antiochus Epiphanes. It says Antiochus was the 8th ruler of the Seleucid Empire. He gave himself the surname Epiphanes, which means the visible god, that he and Jupiter were identical. He acted as though he really were Jupiter, and the people called him Epimanes, which means the madman. So they gave him this nickname that you balmy, basically. He was violently... Now here's the bit, look. He was violently bitter against the Jews and was determined to exterminate them and their religion. He devastated Jerusalem in 168 BC, defiled the temple, offered a pig on its altar, erected an altar to Jupiter, prohibited temple worship, forbade circumcision on pain of death, sold thousands of Jewish families into slavery, destroyed all copies of scripture that could be found, and slaughtered everyone discovered in possession of such copies, and resorted to every conceivable torture to force Jews to renounce their religion. This led to the Maccabean revolt, one of the most heroic feats in history. So this Antiochus Epiphanes is quite an interesting person, pretty diabolical person, because he's coming against the people of God in a massive way, more than any other man during that time period, and maybe at any sort of time period, because what he was doing was absolutely forcing the Jewish religion to stop in its tracks, and prohibited all worship in the temple and erected altars and so on in the temple, actually to Zeus, which we'll have a look at in a second. What did it say in Daniel chapter 8? It said, out of one of them, so out of one of the 4 generals, comes forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great toward the south, east, and to the pleasant land. That's exactly where Antiochus Epiphanes and the kingdom of the Seleucids ended up. This man waxes great, cast down some of the host. When it talks about the host, this is talking about, in symbolic language, the Jewish people. He magnifies himself even to the prince of the host, and look what he does. By him the daily sacrifice was taken away. This isn't to do with AD 70. This is a general coming out of the Seleucid Empire that actually did stop the daily sacrifice taking place, and the sanctuary was cast down. It was thrown down in effect, because nobody could worship any longer in the temple. And really, that is Daniel chapter 8. And maybe if we stopped at that point, we'd say, well, it's ancient history. Are we really that interested? But we are interested for 3 very, very important reasons. Here's the first reason. In verse 17 of Daniel chapter 8, it says, understand, this is what the angel says to Daniel, that the vision concerns the time of the end. Now that's a very interesting phrase, the time of the end, because do you know something? It only occurs 4 times in the whole of your Bible. It occurs once, no, maybe 5 times in the whole of your Bible. It occurs once here in Daniel chapter 8. It occurs twice in Daniel chapter 11, and it occurs twice in Daniel chapter 12. And you know something? Every single solitary time it's talking about the time of the end, which is where we are right now. So we've lurched from Antiochus Epiphanes right the way up to the time of the end, all within Daniel chapter 8. Not only that, it says in verse 19, the angel says to Daniel, I'm going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. So there it is again, we've got the appointed time of the end. This vision, he says, is about the time of the end. What has Antiochus Epiphanes got to do with the time of the end? He's long dead and long gone. In verse 26, this is in a slightly modern version, but even the AV similarly, the vision of the evenings and mornings that has been given you is true, but seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. And brothers and sisters, that's where we are right now, the distant future. We're at the time of the end. This prophecy is about the time of the end. So what does the angel go on and say in relation to the time of the end? Well, this is what he says in relation to the time of the end. He says in verse 23, in the latter part of their reign, when rebels, interestingly, have become completely wicked, a stern-faced king, a master of intrigue, will arise. So this man that arises isn't Antiochus Epiphanes. This is a latter-day man that's appearing at the time of the end. And this is a stern-faced king and is a master of intrigue. He becomes very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy the mighty men and holy people. Pretty similar to Antiochus Epiphanes then. He will cause deceit to prosper. He will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the Prince of Princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. Now this is very interesting, therefore, because this particular man must exist at the time of the end, because he's actually standing against the Prince of Princes, which is code, of course, I believe, for the Lord Jesus Christ. And he comes to his end, but not by human power. So here's what I take from all of this. We should be looking for a latter-day Antiochus Epiphanes. It's as simple as that. There's a latter-day Antiochus Epiphanes to come onto this planet, and he comes at the very, very time of the end. What sort of man is he going to be? Well, I would say, first of all, he's got to be from north of Israel and probably control to some extent the Seleucid area, which predominantly was centred in Syria. He will one day invade Israel, that's absolutely clear, because he comes against the holy people. He will destroy the Jews, therefore. He's a stern-faced man. One of the versions says he's got a fierce countenance. He's going to be a deceitful man. I'm just taking these from the words from these few verses here. He's going to cause astounding devastation. He's going to be a proud and puffed up sort of man. He's even going to stand against Jesus when he returns, and he's going to be destroyed by God's power. That's the man that we're looking for. But we stop and pause, because that is where Daniel 8 comes to an end. But what we're now going to do is go to the parallel chapter, which is Daniel chapter 11. And do you know something? Daniel chapter 11 is identical. It's just told us in a different way. So we're going to have a look now at the fourth dream, or the fourth vision that Daniel had. And I'm now going to play you Daniel chapter 11, not the whole thing. It's a very long chapter. Just going to play you probably 2 minutes worth to give you an idea as to what Daniel saw. So here we go. Daniel chapter, it starts in 10 and concludes in chapter 11.
Chapter 10. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a revelation was given to Daniel, who was also called Belteshazzar. Its message was true, and it concerned a great war. The understanding of the message came to him in a vision.
On the 24th day of the first month, as I was standing on the bank of the great river, the Tigris, I looked up, and there before me was a man dressed in linen, with a belt of the finest gold around his waist. His body was like chrysolite, his face like lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and his voice like the sound of a multitude. I, Daniel, was the only one who saw the vision. The men with me did not see it, but such terror overwhelmed them that they fled and hid themselves. So I was left alone, gazing at this great vision. I had no strength left, my face turned deathly pale, and I was helpless. Then I heard him speaking, and as I listened to him, I fell into a deep sleep, my face to the ground. A hand touched me and set me trembling on my hands and knees. He said, "Daniel, you who are highly esteemed, consider carefully the words I am about to speak to you, and stand up, for I have now been sent to you." And when he said this to me, I stood up, trembling. he continued, "Do not be afraid, Daniel. Since the first day that you set your mind to gain understanding and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to them. But the prince of the Persian kingdom resisted me 21 days. Then Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, because I was detained there with the king of Persia. Now I have come to explain to you what will happen to your people in the future, for the vision concerns a time yet to come."
Chapter 11.
And in the first year of Darius the Mede, I took my stand to support and protect him. Now then, I tell you the truth. 3 more kings will appear in Persia, and then a 4th, who will be far richer than all the others. When he has gained power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king will appear, who will rule with great power and do as he pleases. After he has appeared, his empire will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 winds of heaven. It will not go to his descendants, nor will it have the power he exercised, because his empire will be uprooted and given to others. The king of the south will become strong, but one of his commanders will become even stronger than he, and will rule his own kingdom with great power.
So, look, this is exactly the same story. It's exactly the same story as Daniel chapter 8. We've got in verse 1 and 2 all about the Persian Empire that came to an end. Have a look at it, Daniel 11. It says, I will behold, in verse 2, there will stand up 3 kings in Persia, and so on. And then in verse 3, who do you think the mighty king is who stands up, who takes over the Persian Empire? It's Alexander the Great. It's the horn of the goat. There's this mighty king. It's Alexander the Great. And, of course, what happens in verse 4? When he stands up, his kingdom's broken. That's the breaking of the horn in Daniel chapter 8. And what happens? Exactly what we had in Daniel chapter 8. The kingdom will be divided unto the 4 winds of heaven, not to his own family, nor according to his dominion, but for his kingdom will be plucked up even for others beside those. So in other words, this is talking about the 4 generals. That's why I've got Alexander the Great here, split into 4. Those were the 4 generals that took over from Alexander when he died. And then, you see, what the rest of Daniel 11 does is tracks not all 4 of those generals. It just tracks the 2 that became the most powerful. So the 2 that became most powerful were the Seleucids. Remember, we looked at the Seleucids back in Daniel chapter 8, and the Ptolemaic Empire, which were ruling in Egypt. The other 2 got soaked up pretty much by the Seleucid Empire. So what God has done in his mercy is shown us in Daniel chapter 11 exactly the whole story that Daniel 8 doesn't really cover, of what actually happened between the king of the south, which these guys got called, and the king of the north, which these guys got called. And the reason they were called the king of the south and the king of the north is because they were north and south of Israel. And they were fighting with each other, with Israel in the middle, and Israel kept getting trampled on. Now, let me just give you a summary, and we could do a whole talk on Daniel 11, and we're going to miss out a good chunk of it, but here's a summary of Daniel chapter 11. And by the way, what I'm going to put on the screen here, if you read Elpis Israel, it's word for word the same. We're following exactly what Brother Thomas saw all those years ago. So in verse 1, we've got the kings of Persia. In verse 3, we've got Alexander the Great and Greece on the scene. In verse 4, he dies, the kingdom splits 4 ways. From verses 5 to 7 is pretty much the king of the south in history is actually stronger for a time than the king of the north, and it gives a whole huge amount of detail as to what was going on, and you can plot every single character as you go through this if you want to. But then from verse 8 all the way through to verse 35, the Seleucids are stronger than the Ptolemies, and the Seleucids have got really, really powerful up there in the north. But in particular, from verses 10 all the way through to verse 19, which is all about these Seleucids being stronger than the Ptolemies, we're reading about one man, and that is another guy called Antiochus, not Antiochus Epiphanes. This is talking about Antiochus the Great. So all the way from verses 10 to 19, you're reading about the exploits of Antiochus the Great. All the way from verse 21 right the way through to verse 35, you're reading there about one man. And you're reading there about, lo and behold, Antiochus Epiphanes. This is the little horn, you see, that became super strong, and he did some really diabolical things. And what Daniel 11 does is goes through in more detail about what he actually did. So we haven't got time to look at everything that he did, but let's have a look at some of it. So in verse 31, talking about Antiochus, it says, his armed forces will rise up to what? Desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. Then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation. This is Antiochus's work, nothing whatsoever to do with AD 70. This is all to do with Antiochus desecrating the temple and abolishing. This is telling people you can't sacrifice anymore in here. It wasn't a destruction of the temple. It was just him saying, you're not going to practice your sacrifices here. And in fact, what I'm going to do is set up an abomination in your temple. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. So in Encyclopaedia Britannica, it says, Antiochus Epiphanes set about the extinguishing of the Jewish religion. It was simple enough in Jerusalem itself. A Greek altar was erected upon the old Jewish altar in the temple court, and swine was sacrificed upon it. It goes on and says, Antiochus again entered into Jerusalem, this time plundering and burning and setting up his citadel. For his final act of spite on December the 25th, 167 BC, was to rededicate the temple in Jerusalem to the Olympian god Zeus. That's what he did. This is the abomination that he set up in the temple itself. And so the temple in Jerusalem looked something along those sorts of lines. And what he did inside, because this was a huge building, the temple, it wasn't the size of the tabernacle, which was about the size of this room. It was a massive building. And the statue that he built inside the temple of God to Zeus was just enormous. You can't really see here, but that's the height of a person down here. This is a huge statue that he has put in there, and it's all to do with stopping the Jewish people worshipping. And we could look at more of the things that he did, but we need to race on. And where we race up to is verse 35. Now, if you look at verse 35, it stops talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. It just suddenly stops and gives us this really amazing phrase, the time of the end. So it says in verse 35, some of the wise will stumble so that they may be refined, purified and made spotless until the time of the end, for it will still come at the appointed time. So the very next time the phrase the time of the end is used, it was used once in Daniel 8 for the first time in the whole of the scriptures, and here it is again, the time of the end. So once again, what I'm suggesting to you is, we've got Antiochus Epiphanes, and what he did, suddenly God presses pause, and now all of history flows along, nothing's recorded, and suddenly it all starts again at the time of the end. In fact, I'm just not making this up. Many, many, many people have looked at this and said exactly the same. John Thomas in Elpis Israel says, there is here a break in the prophecy. And by the way, he said exactly what I'm saying. All of that was to do with Antiochus Epiphanes. Where I'm going to divert away from Brother Thomas is what I'm going to say next, because, you'll see in a minute where we go with this. But what God is telling us in Daniel chapter 11 is simply this, that at the time of the end, we're going to see another Antiochus Epiphanes doing similar things to the ancient Antiochus Epiphanes, and in fact we're going to have once more a king of the north versus king of the south situation that happens. There's going to be one very last time where the king of the north and king of the south fight, and it will herald the return of Jesus back to this earth. Now then, we are now in Daniel chapter 11, and we've reached verse 35, and we're at the time of the end. I can tell you for certain we're at the time of the end, because look at verse 35, it says the time of the end. Look at verse 40, and what does it begin with? Time of the end. And in between the time of the end and the time of the end in verse 40, there is a description out the blue about a king. Who is this king? So let's read what this king is, because he's suddenly come out of the blue. He comes out of the blue. But one thing I would say to you is this. This is a man. He lives and breathes as a human being lives and breathes. Every king is identifiable within this chapter. This is a living, breathing human being. And the other point I'm going to say to you is this. He exists at the time of the end. He must exist at the time of the end. He did not exist 150 years ago or 1,000 years ago or even 100 years ago. He exists at the time of the end. Now look at this king and see what he does. And in a minute we're going to compare him back to Daniel 8, and you'll see he's exactly the same man. So in verse 36, out the blue at the time of the end, there's a king that does according to his will. And he exalts himself and magnifies himself above every god, and shall speak marvellous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper until the indignation be accomplished, for that is determined shall be done. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god. He shall magnify himself above all. But in his estate shall he honour the God of forces, that means munitions, army. And a God whom his fathers knew not, will he honour with gold and silver and precious stones and pleasant things. Thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for a gain. In a modern version, that last sentence says, he will honour those who submit to him, appointing them to positions of authority and dividing the land among them as their reward. Keep that in your mind. And look what happens. At the time of the end, the king of the south pushes at him. This is a physical, living, breathing human being on the planet that the king of the south pushes at. Let me just prove to you that this is exactly the same man as Daniel chapter 8. So there's all the list of things about this king in Daniel 11. Here's what it reminds you of what it says about the king in Daniel 8. It says, in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up, and his power shall be mighty, and not by his own power, and he will destroy wonderfully, and will prosper and practice, and will destroy the mighty and holy people, and through his policy also he will cause craft to prosper in his hand, and he will magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many. He will stand against the prince of princes, and he will be broken without hand. Okay, now on the face of it, that might sound different to Daniel 11. But you know something? It isn't. It's exactly the same man. And when I did some study on this, it's quite amazing to see all the words and phrases that link up between the two passages. So here's Daniel 8, here's Daniel 11. This is Daniel 11 verses 36 to 39, talking about that king. Here's Daniel 11 verses 23 to 25, talking about that latter-day Antiochus Epiphanes. You notice they're both kings in red there. You've got this, you can't really read this on here because it's sort of gone blacked out, but let me see if I can read it. Yeah, so we've got words like prosper. So this king over here is going to prosper. This king over here is also going to prosper. We've got the word wonderfully translated here, and it's exactly the same Hebrew word that's translated marvellous over here. We've got that the king magnifies himself here. We've got the king magnifying himself over here. We've got the king practicing here. We've got the same Hebrew word twice over here. The links between these two passages are inextricably put together by God himself. In fact, when you look at Daniel 8:24, the key words in Daniel 8:24 are only found in one other verse in the whole of the Bible, and that is in Daniel 11, verse 36. If you search for it, there's no other verse in all the Bible where those key words come out again. It is the same. Same person. So, Daniel 8 says this king is going to prosper. Daniel 11 says he's going to prosper. Daniel 8 says he's going to magnify himself. Exactly the same words. Daniel 11 says he's going to magnify himself. Daniel 8 says he's going to speak marvellous things. Same word marvellous is translated as wonderfully in Daniel 11. This guy is a latter-day Antiochus Epiphanes, and of course in Daniel 11 we finish with Antiochus Epiphanes, and then there's a huge gap of time and we're told about a king. It is utterly clear that this king is something to do with a latter-day Antiochus Epiphanes. Must be. He's broken without hand. We haven't read this, but at the end of Daniel 11 it says this man comes to his end and none shall help him. It's the same man, latter-day Antiochus Epiphanes. So the question then is, who is this man? He's got to be identifiable because we're given a list of things about him. When you combine it all together, we give him more information about this man than pretty much any other character living and existing at the time of the end, bar none. So he must be a latter-day Antiochus Epiphanes. He must therefore be something to do with the final king of the north. He's possibly based in Syria or certainly north of Israel. He's got to exist at the time of the end. He's got a fierce countenance. He's puffed up and magnifies himself. He causes deceit to prosper. He pretends to be peaceful but destroys many people. He prospers and is successful in everything he does, but he finally comes to his end by God's hand. He doesn't follow the God of his fathers. He loves munitions and armed forces. He worships wealth and gold and precious things. He works in a stronghold. He appoints people to positions of authority and divides the land among his followers for a reward. And that, brothers and sisters, is Daniel 8 and Daniel 11 merged together. There's one other thing that might be worth just quickly pointing out, and that is all of this links directly like a jigsaw puzzle back into Ezekiel as well. So in Ezekiel 38, we read, don't we, about Gog of the land of Magog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. And down Gog comes into Israel. Yeah? Now, Daniel chapter 11 is exactly the same event from verse 40 onwards. So in verse 40, the king of the north comes against the king of the south like a whirlwind, with chariots and horsemen and many ships entering into the glorious land. Daniel 11 is exactly the same event from verse 40 onwards as the whole of Ezekiel 38. All lines up perfectly. Here's the Ethiopians and Libyans, there's the Ethiopians and Libyans. It all lines up. But guess what? For many, many, many years we thought, well, actually there's no mention of Gog in this one, but there is mention of Gog in this one. I tell you what I think. I believe that these first two verses here of Ezekiel 38 talking about Gog of the land of Magog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, is none other than exactly the same king of Daniel chapter 11 verses 36 to 39. Gog is the same man. The king of Daniel 36 to 39 is Gog, the latter day Antiochus Epiphanes. And he becomes the king of the north after the king of the south has pushed at him. I'll give you a translation at the end of all of this that will make it make sense. So, the question then is, if we are looking for latter-day Antiochus Epiphanes, final king of the north, possibly based in Syria, we now know because of the link back to Ezekiel 38 that this man is actually Russian, because we can track where Gog actually lives, which is Magog, Meshech and Tubal, which is the Russian territory. He must exist at the time of the end. He's got a fierce countenance, puffed up, and so on and so on and so on. There is only one man right now that fits this description. And that man is Vladimir Putin. He even looks the same. How amazing is that? You might think maybe they all look the same, but they didn't. Out of all the kings of the Seleucid Empire, none of them looked the same as Putin, apart from Antiochus Epiphanes. This is astounding. Now watch this, because we're going to go through all of this quickly, and you'll see that this man is the one. First of all, where has this man suddenly ended up? He's ended up pouring troops and armaments into the ancient territory of the ancient king of the north, Syria. Now that isn't the end of the story, but you can see his direction of travel. He is trying to begin to control that area. We're told that this man is a man of fierce countenance. Does this look like a man of fierce countenance? It certainly does to me. We're told that he magnifies himself. This man, you can buy calendars of Vladimir Putin, right? You can buy T-shirts. He's even got his own youth movement called the Narshis, believe it or not, where whole crowds of young people, thousands of them, are indoctrinated with worshipping Vladimir Putin. They're all wearing T-shirts on. This is at one of their camps where they've all got his face imprinted on, and the slogan is "Our Choice." He is a man that magnifies himself. Just have a look at what.
There is no other world leader like Vladimir Putin. Action man. Man of the people.
Да здравствует Россия!
And ruler of Russia.
Владимир Путин приветствует экипаж морского тральщика.
From Ukraine to Syria, Vladimir Putin's influence is being felt. He's faced countless accusations of corruption, but still has
record approval, that should say. Mikhail Gorbachev, a few months ago, said, Mikhail Gorbachev says Vladimir Putin views himself as second only to God. This is a man that has certainly magnified himself. In Daniel 8, it said that this man causes deceit to prosper. And only on the 25th of January, for the first time ever, America has point-blank accused Vladimir Putin of being corrupt. This is a major statement for another government to make about another world leader, especially when it's another superpower, but they did. They've even got on their US State Department website talking about Putin's fiction and false claims about the Ukraine and being a master of deception. That's precisely what the Bible says in Daniel 8, that this man will be a master of deception. Just have a little look at this.
Mr. Roldugin hasn't answered our questions. So is he simply a frontman for somebody else?
It looks to me as though he is an instrument. Who is playing him as an instrument is unclear.
Pretty clear who they're thinking it is, though, isn't it? It says that this man would pretend to be peaceful, but actually bring great destruction. And actually, Vladimir Putin fits that bill perfectly. He talks peace, but brings horrific destruction wherever he. It also says, of course, that he's strong and successful in all that he does. Just have a look at him on the stage here.
Good morning, dear members of the Federation Council, members of the State Duma, representatives of the Republic of Crimea and Sevastopol that are among here, citizens of Russia, residents of Crimea and Sevastopol. Thank you.
Уважаемые друзья, сегодня мы собрались по вопросу,
Dear friends,
который
today
имеет
we are here
жизненно важное значение,
about the issue
историческое
that
значение
has a
для всех нас.
vitally important significance, historic significance for all of us. On the 17th of March, in the Crimea, there was a referendum in full correspondence with democratic procedures and international legal norms. More than 82% of the voters took part in the referendum. More than 96% spoke for reunification with Russia. These figures are more than convincing.
That, of course, was when he overtook Crimea and, of course, another successful adventure by Vladimir Putin. We're told that he worships the god of forces or munitions. The spending under Vladimir Putin, under its military, has rocketed up. He's just launched the biggest military parade since the Soviet Union collapsed. This man worships the god of forces, absolutely no shadow of a doubt. But he also, we're told in Daniel 11, worships gold, silver and goods. This came out January the 27th, just a couple of months ago. Is Vladimir Putin the richest man in the world? Expert claims he's richer than Bill Gates. Vladimir Putin could be world's richest person with $257 billion fortune. His tax return last year said he earned $115,000. He's worth multi-billions. We'll look at another little video in just a second. We're nearly finished. But the other interesting thing, you notice it says in, just have a quick look in verse 39 of Daniel 11, this king, it says, shall do or work in the most strongholds. That word stronghold means a fortress. By the way, Vladimir Putin goes to work, and when he goes to work, he goes to this building here. That building is the Kremlin, and the Kremlin is Russian for fortress or stronghold. We're told here that the king works in a stronghold. That is exactly where he works. He works in a stronghold. It's even called that in Russia. Now here's the last little bit. This is in verse 39. This king, this latter-day Antiochus Epiphanes, king of the north, he will honour those who submit to him, appointing them to positions of authority and dividing the land among them as their reward. So this man is basically so corrupt, he is divvying up the country to those people who actually submit to him. Just have a little look at this. This is panorama again.
He's the world leader accused of personally approving murder on the streets of London.
The conclusion that the Russian state was probably involved in the murder of Mr. Litvinenko is deeply disturbing.
But is the president implicated in an assassination also responsible for theft on an extraordinary scale?
He has fleets of things that almost no billionaire in the West would have.
Vladimir Putin has been accused of looting his own country.
Today, Putin behaves like a czar.
Tonight, we investigate the truth about President Putin's riches.
Why would it be kept secret? Because it belongs personally to Putin, not to the state.
And for the first time, the Americans say what they really think about the Russian president.
Is Vladimir Putin corrupt?
In our view, yes.
The men closest to Putin have been with him for years. They were with him here in St. Petersburg, and they've stayed with him ever since. And this is the group that he trusts and that he rewards. And this is the group that runs Russia.
Putin's lawyer at the town hall became president and then prime minister of Russia. His former deputy also served as prime minister. The chief of staff at the town hall now runs Russia's anti-drugs agency. His former assistant now runs the biggest oil company in the world. and his former economist now runs the biggest gas company in the world. For those who've been in Putin's circle, the benefits have been immense. A cellist who is godfather to Putin's daughter has a valuable stake in a major Russian bank. A neighbor has an even bigger stake. Another neighbor ended up running the railways. A childhood friend has made a fortune from government contracts. And his brother has made even more. The Americans say this is how Putin's Russia works.
All of this has come out in the last 2 months. It's no coincidence. Panorama's got onto this and it's been blasted over on our airwaves. This is telling us, as clearly as God ever could, this is the man. So we look for a man who is latter-day Antiochus Epiphanes, the final king of the north, possibly based in Syria, north of Israel. We know he's related to Gog now. He must exist at the time of the end. He's got a fierce countenance. He's puffed up and magnifies himself. He causes deceit to prosper. He pretends to be peaceful but ends up destroying people. He prospers in all that he does. He doesn't follow the God of his fathers. He worships munitions and armed forces. He worships wealth and gold and precious things. He works in a stronghold. He appoints people to positions of authority, and he rewards his followers, and every single one of those is a tick. Who else is going to fit all of this? It's absolutely astounding. So here is me rewriting verse 36 to 40 in English, okay? This is how I see it. A national ruler, the king, similar, or Tsar we might say, similar to Antiochus Epiphanes, will arise at the time of the end. His name, I believe, is Vladimir Putin. He will magnify himself and be puffed up. He will succeed in all he does until he is finally destroyed. He doesn't regard anything other than his own self-interest. The two things he does worship are armed forces and material things. He works in the Kremlin. He honours those who submit to him, appointing them to positions of authority and dividing the land among them as their reward. And at the time of the end, the king of the south, the Saudi, American, UK bloc of nations, militarily provoke Putin. In verse 40 it says that the king of the south pushes at this man. This causes Putin to send his northern army. This is why the king of the north is mentioned in verse 40, because Putin is a man here, but he sends his northern army down into Syria. At this point he then is definitely the king of the north because he's controlling Syria, and as he comes down through Syria, he's into the heartland of Antiochus Epiphanes, and he swoops down like a whirlwind into Israel and beyond into Egypt. So verse 40, when it says at the time of the end the king of the south will push at him, that is the king of that is America and Britain pushing at the king of the previous verse, which is Putin. And then the king of the north, so now Putin has changed. After the push, he's now the king of the north, and he's coming against the king of the south like a whirlwind. Putin will invade Israel. I'm absolutely convinced about it. We're told in Daniel 8 verse 24 that this very man will destroy powerful leaders and devastate the holy people, the people of God. In Daniel 11 verse 40 it says the same thing. He will invade various lands and sweep through them like a flood. He will enter the glorious land of Israel, and many nations will fall. And in Ezekiel 38 it says exactly the same thing. A long time from now, you, Gog, latter-day Antiochus Epiphanes, Vladimir Putin, will be called into action. In the distant future, you will swoop down on the land of Israel, which will be enjoying peace after recovering from war, and after its people have returned from many lands to the mountains of Israel. But this man is going to come to his end. And that he comes to his end not by any natural cause, because we're told in Ezekiel 38 that I will punish you, Gog, and your armies with disease, blood and bloodshed. I will send torrential rain, hailstones, fire and burning sulphur. That's what the end for this man is. In Daniel 8:25 it says the same thing. He will even take on the prince of princes in battle, but he will be broken, though not by human power. He's going to come to his end in a supernatural way. In verse 45 of Daniel 11, it says he will stop between the glorious holy mountain and the sea and will pitch his royal tents, but while he is there, his time will suddenly run out and no one will help him. He will come to his end in a pretty spectacular way. The point is, if we're right on this, we've seen just about every single solitary thing tick now. It can't be a coincidence that all the stuff we're seeing on the news yesterday and the day before and so on is pointing at this very man and saying, look what he is doing. If that isn't a wake-up call, I don't know what is. We are absolutely on the brink, I think, of seeing this man potentially do all the things that God has said that he would do. I need to keep watching. Thank you for listening.